In June 2026, a team of geneticists sat down with 112 ancient human genomes pulled from 8 archaeological sites scattered across Henan province. And what they found in that data made them stop and recheck their numbers twice. The genomes spanned more than 6,000 years, from a small site called Xiaowu near Lingbao, all the way up to remains barely a century old. And when they lined up the oldest DNA next to the newest, the match was almost impossible to believe. The people living along the middle stretch of the Yellow River today are, genetically speaking, still the same population that was farming that same stretch of land 6,200 years ago. Not similar, not related in some loose, distant way. The same lineage, carried forward without a break through flood, famine, invasion, and empire, for longer than the pyramids have existed. If you are watching this, subscribe now, because next week I am covering the DNA evidence suggesting Polynesian sailors reached the coast of South America centuries before Columbus was even born. This is not a story about symbolism or myth. This is 4 billion people today carrying a genetic signature that traces back to a single river valley in Neolithic China, and the implications of that continuity are stranger than anything in the textbooks. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the researchers were actually trying to solve. For over a century, archaeologists had a problem. They knew the Yellow River Basin had been continuously farmed since the Neolithic. They knew that a culture called Yangshao, first identified in 1921 at a village in Mianchi County in Henan, stretched from roughly 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, and was the most widely distributed Neolithic culture in all of China. What they didn't have was genomic proof connecting that ancient population directly to the people living in the same region today. Genomic data from the Yangshao heartland in western Henan had been scarce for decades. Scientists had bones. They had pottery. They had house foundations and painted ceramics dug carefully out of loess soil that had preserved them for thousands of years. What they didn't have, until this study led by researchers from Fudan University, alongside the Henan Provincial Institute of Cultural Heritage and Archaeology, and Zhengzhou University, was a clean genetic thread running from the Neolithic straight through to the present. DNA works like a fingerprint that degrades in predictable ways. When a population stays isolated and continuous, its genetic markers barely shift over centuries. When a population gets replaced, invaded, or absorbed by outsiders, you see it immediately in the genome. Mutations accumulate, ancestry components shift, new haplogroups appear where they didn't exist before. This is how geneticists reconstruct history without written records. They read the DNA the way you'd read tree rings, except instead of counting years, they're counting the subtle chemical scars left behind. Every time one group of humans mixed with, replaced, or diverged from another. Modern labs do this using tools with names like principal component analysis and admixture modeling, statistical methods that take raw genetic variation and turn it into a map of who is related to whom and by how much. So the team sequenced genome after genome from these 8 sites. The oldest samples from Xiaowu turned out to be among the earliest Yangshao-related genomes ever recovered from the Middle Yellow River. And when they compared those 6,000-year-old genomes to the DNA of people living in the same river valley today, the ancestry components lined up almost perfectly. The population had not been replaced. It had not been diluted into unrecognizability. It had simply continued, generation after generation, on the same land, farming the same crops for 6 millennia. Archaeologists on the project noted that this genetic result actually confirmed something the physical evidence had been hinting at for years: layers of continuous settlement stacked directly on top of each other at site after site, with no gap, no destruction layer, no sign of an outside population moving in and taking over. That alone would be a remarkable finding. But it's only the surface of a much bigger genetic story that researchers have been piecing together over the last several years, one excavation at a time, and it goes back even further than the Yangshao culture itself. Before Yangshao, before any of the sites we now associate with early Chinese civilization, there were hunter-gatherer populations scattered across what's now northern China, living along the coast and river systems in small, mobile groups. Genomic work on early Neolithic remains from coastal northern China shows these hunter-gatherers had their own distinct ancestry, separate from what would eventually dominate the region. They fished, they foraged, and they moved with the seasons, leaving behind shell middens and scattered campsites rather than permanent villages. Somewhere around 7,000 years ago, agriculture changed everything. Millet farming, specifically 2 hardy crops called foxtail millet and broomcorn millet, took hold in the Yellow River Basin. These crops were domesticated independently in China. They weren't borrowed from the wheat and barley agriculture developing in the Fertile Crescent thousands of miles away. This was a separate agricultural revolution, happening on its own timeline, driven by its own environmental pressures, suited to the dry, dusty Loess Plateau rather than the river valleys of the Middle East. And once millet farming took hold, the population that grew alongside it exploded. Villages appeared with circular house foundations arranged in deliberate patterns, evidence of planning and shared labor rather than scattered, disorganized camps. Painted pottery showed up with distinctive geometric designs that archaeologists still study today, red and black patterns swirling across ceramic bowls and jars. The earliest proto-writing, symbols etched onto pottery and bone, started showing up at Yangshao sites centuries before anything resembling the mature oracle bone script of the later Shang dynasty. This was a population that was organizing itself, developing shared symbols and expanding its footprint across the lowest plateau of northern China. And crucially, it was doing this while staying remarkably genetically stable, absorbing the earlier hunter-gatherer groups into its expanding gene pool rather than being wiped out by them or by anyone else. By the time you reach the Longshan culture, which followed Yangshao and bridged the gap between prehistoric village life and the early dynastic states, the genetic picture gets more complicated in a fascinating way. Recent ancient genome work on Longshan era remains from the Central Plains, and the lower Yellow River Basin found something researchers didn't expect. Populations that were geographically close to each other, sometimes just a few hundred kilometers apart, showed real genetic differentiation. At one site, called Sujiakundong, most individuals carried mixed ancestry, the vast majority tracing to Central Plains Longshan populations, but with a smaller genetic contribution, about 6%, from populations connected to southeastern coastal China. At another site nearby, called Zhouhe, the population was far more genetically uniform, showing almost entirely Central Plains Longshan ancestry with none of that coastal signal. This tells you something important. Late Neolithic China wasn't one uniform genetic block, slowly expanding outward in a straight line. It was a patchwork of related but distinct populations, some more mixed than others, all eventually feeding into what would become the ancestral pool for dynastic Chinese civilization. And what's striking is that when researchers then compared these Longshan-era genomes to people living in the same region during the Han Dynasty, roughly 2,000 years later, and to modern Han Chinese populations from Shandong today, they found a high degree of genetic continuity across all three time points. The Longshan population, particularly the Central Plains variant, appears to be one of the dominant genetic contributors to everything that came after, a foundation that later dynasties, migrations, and conquests were all layered on top of without ever erasing it. Now here's where this story takes an unexpected turn, because genetic continuity does not mean genetic isolation, and the data on that point is where things get genuinely surprising. A separate study looking at the Yellow River Bend, the northern frontier where the river curves and China's agricultural heartland meets the edge of the Mongolian steppe, sequenced whole genomes from 23 individuals spanning the late Neolithic through the Bronze and Iron Ages. Researchers confirmed that Yangshao-related ancestry from the Central Plains formed the major component of the local gene pool in this frontier region, just as you'd expect. But during the late Neolithic period specifically, this Yellow River Bend population received what researchers called an indispensable genetic contribution from the Mongolian steppe. Outside ancestry was flowing into the edges of the Yellow River world thousands of years before anyone had written a single word about steppe nomads or northern barbarians. And, even stranger, some of the Neolithic individuals at these frontier sites showed an unexpected genetic influence from populations in southern China, a signal that persisted all the way through the Bronze and Iron Ages. So, even at the very edge of the Yellow River civilization, in a region defined by its interaction with outsiders, you don't see wholesale replacement. You see a dominant, continuous core population absorbing genetic input from multiple directions, at once, north and south, without ever losing its fundamental identity. This pattern of absorption, rather than replacement, becomes even clearer once you follow the story south, toward the Yangtze River basin. While millet farmers were building their world along the Yellow River, a completely separate agricultural tradition was developing along the Yangtze, based on wet rice cultivation rather than millet. Sites associated with this culture show sophisticated pile-dwelling architecture built over water and long traditions of jade carving that are distinctly southern in character, developing on a timeline stretching back 8,000 years or more. These rice farming populations had their own distinct genetic profile, separate from the Yellow River millet farmers to the north, and their own material culture, their own pottery styles, and their own approach to organizing village life around wetland agriculture rather than dryland fields. As Yellow River populations began expanding southward, starting somewhere in the vicinity of 5,000 years ago, they encountered these established Yangtze rice farming communities. And the genetic record shows exactly what happened next. Not conquest and replacement, but blending. Modern populations across southern China today carry a genetic profile dominated by Yellow River ancestry, but layered with real, measurable admixture from the original Yangtze rice farmers. And that admixture follows a clean geographic gradient. The closer you get to the ancient rice farming heartland, the higher the proportion of that original southern ancestry shows up in people living there today. Move further from that zone and the signal fades, though even in the deep south, Yellow River ancestry remains the dominant component of the genome. This wasn't a one-time event either. Researchers studying lower Yellow River populations found that this exchange between northern millet farmers and southern rice farmers played out repeatedly across the Neolithic and into the Han Dynasty, with the lower Yellow River basin itself acting as a kind of genetic crossroads, a nexus where northern and southern lineages met and mixed for thousands of years before either side settled into the population structure we see in China today. One study modeling ancestry in lower Yellow River groups found the middle Neolithic Yellow River component ranging anywhere from roughly a quarter to nearly 3/4 of an individual's ancestry depending on the site, with the remainder split between older coastal hunter-gatherer ancestry and southern East Asian input. A genetic mosaic built up slowly over thousands of years of contact, rather than a single sweeping event. The expansion into the west and the highlands tells an even more dramatic version of this same story. When Yellow River descended populations pushed into the mountainous regions that are now home to the Qiang and Tibetan peoples, they didn't erase what was already there. They merged with it. A recent study analyzing 20 deep-sequenced Chang genomes alongside Tibetan Highlander DNA and neighboring lowland populations traced the most recent common ancestor of the Chang people back to ancient Yellow River farmers, roughly 5,300 years ago, confirming that even one of the more geographically isolated populations in western China shares deep roots with the same Yellow River lineage running through everyone else. The Qiang today are widely considered a kind of basal layer of the broader Chinese gene pool, a population whose genetic structure has since been reshaped by centuries of additional mixing with both Han and Tibetan neighbors, producing several genetically distinct subgroups within what looks, from the outside, like a single ethnic community. But the Tibetan populations in that same study showed something the lowland Han Chinese populations simply don't carry. A genetic variant tied to a gene called EPAS1, which helps the body process oxygen more efficiently at extreme altitude, shows up in the overwhelming majority of Tibetan Highlanders and is almost completely absent in lowland Han Chinese populations. That variant didn't come from the Yellow River migrants. It came from populations who had already been living on the high plateau for thousands of years before those migrants arrived, adapting biologically to conditions no lowland farmer could have survived without help. When the two populations mixed, the newcomers picked up a genetic tool they didn't have, one that let their descendants thrive above 4,000 meters in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Without that borrowed adaptation, the expansion into the high plateau might have simply failed, leaving the Yellow River farmers stalled at the foot of the mountains instead of settling permanently among them. By the time you reach the Han Dynasty, roughly 2,000 years ago, the genetic picture of what would become the Han Chinese population was largely locked in. And this is where the continuity story becomes almost eerie. Researchers who sequenced 14 ancient genomes from a Western Han Dynasty site called Yangshao Bay in Shandong Province found that this population was genetically distinct from the much earlier hunter-gatherers who had lived in the same region thousands of years before, but was closely aligned instead with populations from the Middle Neolithic all the way through the Iron Age in the Middle and Lower Yellow River Basin. In other words, the genetic transition from hunter-gatherer to farmer had already happened, and once it did, the farming population held steady for thousands of years afterward. And when researchers compared that Han Dynasty population directly to modern Han Chinese people living in Shandong today, they found a high degree of genetic homogeneity between the two, separated by 2,000 years and by every dynasty, war, famine, and political upheaval that happened in between. The researchers described the lower Yellow River Basin as a nexus of genetic exchange between the northern millet farmers and the southern rice farmers, a meeting point that kept receiving fresh cultural and genetic input from the middle Yellow River, even as it also absorbed influence from the south, all without losing its own core identity. Now compare that to what was happening in Europe during roughly the same window of prehistory, because the contrast is what makes the Chinese case so unusual. Around 5,000 years ago, pastoralist populations from the Eurasian steppe swept westward into Europe and, in some regions, replaced the majority of the existing male population within just a few generations. Genetic studies of Bronze Age Britain show a similarly dramatic population turnover when a new archaeological culture associated with distinctive bell-shaped pottery arrived on the island. Within a few centuries, the genetic makeup of the population had shifted so severely that modern Europeans are best described as a layered mosaic, with hunter-gatherer, early farmer, and steppe pastoralist ancestry all stacked on top of each other in varying proportions depending on the region. There is no single clean line you can draw from any one ancient European population straight through to the people living in that same region today, because the region didn't experience one continuous population. It experienced several, overlapping and replacing each other in waves, so that a modern Spaniard and a modern Scandinavian, despite both being broadly European, actually carry meaningfully different ratios of these ancestral components. China's story, at least in its core Yellow River heartland, doesn't look like that. It looks like one dominant lineage that expanded, absorbed neighboring groups through intermarriage and cultural assimilation, picked up useful genetic and cultural adaptations along the way, and never experienced the kind of total population replacement that reshaped Europe. Even when outside powers did conquer the region politically, the genetic story stayed remarkably stable. When the Mongols under Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty in the 13th century and ruled over China for nearly 100 years, geneticists can still detect a small trace of Mongol ancestry in northern Chinese populations today, but it remains a minor genetic contribution rather than anything resembling a takeover. The Manchu conquest in the 17th century, which established the Qing dynasty and lasted far longer than Mongol rule, produced a similar pattern. Political control changed hands completely. The genetic and cultural core of the population did not. Why did China avoid the kind of genetic upheaval that reshaped Europe, the Americas, and so much of the rest of the ancient world? Geography plays a major role. The Yellow River Basin sits inside a kind of natural fortress. The Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau form an almost impassable barrier to the southwest. The Taklamakan and Gobi deserts create another formidable barrier to the northwest. The mountains of southwestern China are rugged enough that large-scale migration through them was never easy. None of these barriers made the region unconquerable, as history proves repeatedly, but they did limit the kind of sudden, large-scale population replacement that steppe migrations inflicted on Europe. Invasions into the Yellow River heartland tended to come from neighboring regions that had already experienced centuries of genetic exchange with the people already living there, rather than from entirely unrelated populations arriving all at once and overwhelming everyone in their path the way the steppe migrations did further west. Agriculture reinforced that stability. Dense farming populations are simply harder to displace than sparse ones. The millet farming regions of the north and the rice farming regions of the south could support agricultural population densities that dwarfed what the pastoralist regions to the north could sustain. When an invading force is vastly outnumbered by the settled population it's trying to conquer, even a successful military campaign rarely translates into genetic replacement. You get political control layered on top of a population that keeps farming, keeps marrying within itself, and keeps passing its genes forward largely undisturbed, generation after generation, no matter which dynasty happens to sit on the throne. And then there's the cultural piece, which may be the most important factor of all. Chinese civilization developed a writing system, and unlike spoken language, that writing system stayed remarkably stable, even as regional dialects diverged so far apart that a speaker from the north and a speaker from the south might not be able to understand each other out loud. They could still read the same characters and communicate on the page. That shared literate culture created a kind of gravitational pull. Successive waves of conquerors, from the Mongols to the Manchus, found that the fastest path to legitimate rule wasn't replacing the existing population, it was joining it. China's civil service examination system, which selected government officials based on mastery of Confucian classical texts, created an enormous incentive for non-Han elites to adopt Chinese language, Chinese customs, and Chinese identity if they wanted any real power. Their children intermarried into Han families. Within a couple of generations, distinct outsider identities tended to dissolve into the broader population rather than reshaping it. By the end of the Qing dynasty, most Manchu families carried significant Han ancestry, a quiet genetic and cultural absorption that happened over and over throughout Chinese history whenever a new group arrived at the top, from steppe conquerors down to smaller regional dynasties that briefly seized control of the north. What emerges from all of this ancient DNA work isn't a simple story of one untouched population sitting still for 7,000 years. It's something more interesting than that. It's a story of one dominant lineage, rooted in the millet fields of the Yellow River Basin, that expanded outward in every direction, absorbed hunter-gatherers, rice farmers, steppe herders, and highland populations into itself, picked up useful genes and cultural practices along the way, and somehow never lost its fundamental identity in the process. Modern researchers describe this less as a single, monolithic ethnic block, and more as a genetic spectrum. A Yellow River core with varying degrees of regional blending depending on how far you travel from that original heartland and which neighboring populations happened to be nearby when the expansion reached them. Northern populations closest to the original Yangshao and Longshan heartlands carry the strongest and most direct genetic signal from those ancient farmers. Southern populations carry more of that Yangtze rice farmer heritage mixed in. Western populations near the Tibetan Plateau carry traces of highland ancestry, and, in some cases, genetic adaptations that arrived through that very same mixing. But in every region, across thousands of kilometers and thousands of years, that Yellow River signal remains present, remains dominant, and remains traceable all the way back to small farming villages that existed before the pyramids, before Stonehenge, before writing existed almost anywhere else on Earth. This also reframes a question that had puzzled historians for a long time. Why Chinese civilization never went through the kind of total collapse that ended Bronze Age societies elsewhere in the ancient world. Egypt had periods of genuine political and social collapse. The Indus Valley civilization disappeared as an identifiable urban culture entirely. Rome fractured and fell. China went through dynastic cycles, periods of division followed by reunification, but the underlying population, the writing system, and the agricultural base never broke down completely. Continuity on that scale creates a kind of institutional memory that's hard to find anywhere else in the ancient world. A civilization that could absorb invasion after invasion, famine after famine, and political collapse after political collapse, and keep functioning because the people, the language, and the land underneath it all stayed connected. Every new dynasty, whether founded by a peasant rebellion or a foreign cavalry force, inherited the same farmers, the same fields, and the same written language that every dynasty before it had relied on. The genetic findings from the 2026 Fudan and Henan study, along with the growing body of ancient genome research from Shandong, the Yellow River Bend, and the Tibetan borderlands, all point in the same direction. Chinese civilization along the Yellow River developed its agriculture, its writing, and its social structures independently, without borrowing its foundations wholesale from any outside source, and then maintained a level of genetic continuity across 7 millennia that has very few parallels anywhere else on the planet. That is not folklore. That is not nationalist mythology dressed up as science. That is what 112 carefully sequenced ancient genomes, compared against thousands of years of archaeological and historical evidence, actually show. The ancestors of thousands of millions of people alive today were farming millet along a river in northern China. 7,000 years ago, and through every empire, invasion, and upheaval since, their descendants never really left. If you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. Because next week, I'm covering the ancient DNA pulled from the Tarim Basin mummies, and explaining why people buried in the middle of Western China thousands of years ago show genetic features that have researchers rethinking the migration routes across Central Asia entirely. That video will be up on the channel soon, so keep an eye out for it.